really does feel like quite a milestone, really. I know we've been meeting up in the pub, doing social events over the past few months, but now, you know, sort of coming back and having this type of meetup again, you know, sort of, yeah, really feels like we've kind of where we are today. Like, so does somebody want to say something about Freedom Works? Yeah, go on.
Hello, everyone. Hi. So yeah, we're Freedom Works. We've got 10 spaces. This is the newest one in Brighton, been here since January. And yeah, we're a co-working space, all about flexibility and building community and having like peers helping each other, you know. So we like to have networking events such as this one, just so that everyone can help each other out. And yeah, and offer a range of flexible packages with hot desks, permanent offices and meetings. But yeah, that's a little bit about Freedom Works. But please do have a look around if you like. Yeah.
Great, thanks a lot. Yeah. Yeah, and Silicon Brighton, of course, who have been supporting us as well. And I think Charlie's going to say a few words about them.
I'm indeed. Thank you, Paul. Can I grab that clicker off you as well? Thank you, mate. Yes, I am. Hello, I'm Charlie. For those of you I've not had the pleasure to meet yet, I work in events and community engagement for Silicon Brighton, and we are the host of Brighton Host Tech Sector. We support over 30 different meetup groups across the tech and digital sector within the city, including now WordUp Brighton, which we're absolutely over the moon about. It's fantastic. All of our events are free to join, available to people at all levels, and they're all hybrid. So obviously you guys are all in the room with us here tonight, but we're also running a live stream on YouTube. Hello to everyone on YouTube who's watching, so that we can broadcast to all audiences and also keep a video of the event for you to watch back afterwards and share with whoever you would like as well. None of the work that we do would be possible without the help of our supporters, all of whom are on screen now, and all of whom we owe a huge debt of thanks to. And if there's a company that you know that might be interested in supporting us on our mission to put Brighton on the map as a tech hub in the country, then please point them in our direction. Like I say, if there's anybody who you know who might be interested in helping us out as a sponsor or a supporter, please point them in our direction. But we are always looking for support with help volunteering at events, help setting everything up, or maybe you'd like to help a meetup organizer by contributing to running the events within the group each month, or coming and doing a talk. Like, there's so many ways that you can get involved, and we would absolutely love to touch base with as many people as possible. These are our values, which we look to uphold throughout all of the events and all of the work that we do. And if you feel at any point that these aren't being upheld, we would really like to know. So please come and talk to me anytime if you do feel that. You can follow us on socials as well, on Instagram, LinkedIn, Twitter /X, and TikTok, where we are all at Silicon Brighton. And you can stay up to date with all of the events that we are doing at siliconbrighton.com/events, or you can scan this QR code. We are very busy at the moment. It's fantastic. On Thursday, there is the UX Up Summer Bash and Async, and Lean Agile Brighton. And on Wednesday next week as well, there's also Lean Agile Brighton and PHP Sussex. So it's all going on. At this QR code, you can join our Slack community, which if you haven't done so yet, I would strongly recommend. There's so many resources and so many different things being shared across there. And it's a great place to connect with people who you haven't yet met, or maybe you've met in passing, but it's a better way to, follow up with that conversation that you half had at an event. And finally, you can join the meetup page for WordUp Brighton at this QR code, or on the meetup page where you all signed up tonight. If you join the meetup page, then you'll get a notification each time that the next event is released. So you'll always be in the know and up to date with everything that we've got going on. WordUp, this is you. Cool. I'm going to pass over. Thank you very much.
Cheers, Charlie. Cheers. So many QR codes. Look at them all. Look at loads of QR codes. Who would have predicted that before COVID, that QR codes would come back with a vengeance like that? So yeah, I'm thinking about the best way of keeping in touch between meetups. Like there's the WordPress UK Slack group, which you can join there, and there's a Meetup Brighton channel. Like so. I think, you know, that might be as good a place as any. I do want to try and get a mailing list back up and running, but I haven't got the website up or the mailing list yet or something like that, but watch out for that. Just because I think it'd be good not to just be relying on the Meetup platform, basically. So yeah, do keep in touch between things. Also, yeah, talking about websites, we need to do some rebranding. Like, so if any of you are designers and want to get involved in that, or know somebody who is, who might be able to help us out, that'd be really great. Come and speak to me, please. Like, so upcoming WordUp. So we're going to do it on the first Tuesday of the month, each month. Like, so, but you might have noticed it's taken us a while to get going. So we're alternating between doing an event like this, a speaker event, and doing a more social event, basically, like we have been doing before. So next month's going to be a social. Then after that is August, which isn't a great month for meetups anyway, but Silicon Brighton march at Pride and do an event for Pride. So we thought we'd get involved in that. Like, and then 3rd of September will be a speaker event, but we haven't got the speaker confirmed yet, unfortunately. Like, then it will be 1st of October is a social again. Then we'll have the speaker in November, and then December is Christmas. Like, there's a Christmas social that Silicon Brighton do as well, like for the local groups. So we'll get involved in that as well, basically. Like, so yeah, we've got some. I have got some good speakers, but I just can't tell you who they're going to be yet. Like, so I thought I'd just plug WordCamp Europe. Like, it's on next, not this weekend, but the next weekend. Like, and you can stream all of that online and watch it. And yeah, it's good fun. And you can be jealous of all of the people that are out in Italy. So yeah, do that. So now. It's Tommy time. Tommy, who's kindly come to speak to us this evening about digital sustainability. He used to, he used to run this meetup. Like, he organised the last WordCamp that we had in Brighton. So he's, you know, sort of been a fundamental part of the Brighton WordPress scene for quite some time. He now works at Wholegrain Digital. Yeah, I'd like to hand it over to Tommy, really, to talk to us about digital sustainability.
Thank you. Thanks. I'll get set up. I'll do the little screen share dance first. So just talk amongst yourselves. It's the point of the afternoon, evening where we do that.
Whilst you get yourself set up, I can just tell you all.
You don't want that. That over here.
I can just tell you all that Does it work for you, Tom, if we do questions at the end?
Absolutely. I'm
okay.
fine for that. Yeah, no problem.
And we've got this mic over here, which I'll get passed down the line. If you've got a question, make sure you've got a mic before you ask it so that everybody who's watching online can hear you as well. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Yeah, hopefully this is working for everyone online. But yes, we'll talk about digital sustainability 101. So there's a lot of detail to go into. We'll try and hit all the big stuff at the start, but bear with, there's plenty of content to get on with. Yeah, so as very kindly introduced, I'm Tommy. I work at Wholegrain Digital. I'm the tech delivery lead, so I help run the tech team with Dan over there. And yeah, we're London's original sustainability WordPress agency. So we primarily work with WordPress, or we try and get people away into WordPress, basically. But today I'll be talking to you about how to start greening the web. Basically, that'll be mostly tech. There's a bit of design in there, but really just about how to make your websites more efficient, more green, and just generally start spreading the good vibes of sustainability throughout the web. But we'll start with an introduction to digital carbon emissions, because I think that's really, we kind of need to know why we're trying to do this and what the big deal is, basically, before we start making changes. And really, it starts with like tweets and websites don't end up in landfill. So there's not really like pollution going on there. But there is still an energy cost to websites and to sites out there. We kind of have this vibe that maybe the internet and websites, they just kind of live in the cloud. They're not physical. We don't really need to worry about them. But actually, there's a whole lot going on there that we kind of don't really think about. And if you want to boil it really all the way down, you can just say that data for a website is equal to electricity, which is equal to CO2, some sort of equivalent like that. And that's the easiest way to kind of boil it down. If you want to, you can kind of tick that you've got all of the information. You can go home now. So we'll call it there, shall we? Yeah, we'll just, yeah. But yeah, so this is where the emissions are in your journey through looking at a website. So it starts with the production of the devices that you use. So that'll be your laptops, your tablets, and so on. The data stored in data centers. That's where websites are run, servers, and so on. They're transmitted across networks to get to your end user device. And that's basically your phones and stuff that you're watching Netflix on or joining a Zoom call or whatever. And for now, we're going to focus on these three areas. The production is kind of hard to kind of talk about, really, because that's really, if you're in the manufacturing business, we'll kind of step away from that. But this is the area where we, the people who are watching this can really make a difference, basically. So the data centers, networks, and end user devices. And the ways that we can do that for each of those is we can reduce the server load by making sure that we're not uploading loads of big stuff to those servers, making sure they're running efficiently. We're picking good servers to run from. We're reducing the data transfer that's required to get to end user devices. And that will ultimately reduce device energy usage as well. So those are kind of the three ways that we can save energy along the way. But we'll look at those in detail now. So this is kind of what I think we all picture when we see like a data center. It's like a glowing room full of servers just ticking away. But obviously they kind of require energy to keep them going, and not just to keep them running and keep them on 24/7, but to keep them cool as well. So there's a whole load of energy that kind of goes into just storing websites and data and stuff like that. And to give you an idea of the scale, we used to say that this was the kind of one of the biggest single server data centers in the world. So 140,000 square meters, you've got like a football pitch up there. The White House is over there to scale, just to give you an idea of how big these things can get. And there's like 700 or more around the world, basically. But now that's kind of gone up by quite a lot. So there's a much bigger one in Nevada, which is like almost 680,000 square meters. It's absolutely ginormous. It's gone up like 400%, basically. And I think that's before pandemic and after pandemic. They were building it for many years, both of these, but there's been a massive jump, and there's predictions that those will keep going up, basically. There will become more of these. They will get bigger. So the scale is quite astronomical, really. But moving on. You've also got the transmission networks. These are something that we need to think about, the data that we're sending to people's devices. Users can't really kind of impact these very much. So it's something that we need to be really cautious of and really aware of when we're transferring that data. And finally, yeah, you have the end user devices, phones, tablets, big screen TVs that connect to the internet, whatever it is that you're going to be viewing your Netflix or your Zoom or your websites on. And this is, again, one of the areas we can have a really big impact. I'm sort of sidestepping all the ways we got satellites up into the sky, and that's sort of the manufacturing area. There's like a huge amount of satellites out there that have all been blasted up into space, probably most of them by SpaceX, I would imagine at this point. And that's not to talk about the cables that are in the sea as well, that connect all of the continents to all the data centers all around the world. Again, this is quite physical, but basically, I think this highlights just how physical the internet really is. It's very easy to think that it just is out there in a cloud. But ultimately, the amount of cables that you've got here could go to the moon and back 3 times. So there's quite a staggering amount of hardware out there to kind of create this connected network that is the internet. So I feel like I've made my point now. But in terms of global emissions, the amount of like pollution effectively that the internet creates, perhaps we can do a bit of a comparison. So At the moment, internet and computing in general is meant to be about 2 to 4% of global emissions, global carbon emissions, which doesn't sound like a lot, but the UK itself is 1%. So it's twice the size of the UK carbon emissions. And global aviation, this is pre-pandemic, I believe. We're almost getting back up to that level again, but global aviation is 2.1. So the lower end of what the internet itself is generating as a whole. So hopefully that should give you an idea of the scale of the amount of carbon on a global scale that the internet is generating. And if the internet was a country, it would be the 4th largest polluter, beaten only by China, USA, and India, and it would be about the same as Russia. So pretty heavy stuff. And the problem in terms of the data that we're creating, that's not really visible to us, the users, the people that create the websites. I'm going to do a shameless plug here about making digital emissions visible. So Website Carbon is a tool that Wholegrain Digital created back in 2017, I think. And basically, it's a really great way to measure your website. It will measure a single page at a time, and it will tell you the estimated carbon output of that page, basically. And it will give you, we've updated it recently, it's got a nice little ranking system from A down to F. There's a global average, I believe, around F, which is should give you a bit of a scale of things. But you can run your sites through that and just see roughly how you're coming out to give you a little ballpark. And we'll come back to this a little bit later. I will also reference that through the slides, I've got a few points where we reference carbon scores. We've recently updated the algorithm to figure out how much carbon is generated because times have changed and things have become more efficient. So those might not be super accurate in this deck, but the tool will let you accurately measure your own site, basically. And perhaps we should talk about, like, okay, so great, we want to heal the world and do all that nice stuff, but what are the other benefits of sustainable web design? You know, it's really nice that we want to, you know, reduce carbon and climate change is definitely a thing, but is there any way you can kind of sell this to people that maybe aren't kind of bought into that whole thing? And it turns out that it's actually really good for everybody else as well. So it's quite an easy sell in some ways. If you can get people listening to the other benefits, you can make your site faster. You can improve your SEO rankings, which lots of marketing people will be very happy about. And hopefully you can get cheaper hosting and more conversion. So actually there's a potential for you to increase your revenue because you're making a better site, basically. And finally, I will address kind of perhaps the elephant in the room. If you kind of reduce your carbon on your website, is it just like a drop in the ocean? You're not really making that big of an impact, right? It feels like it might be just a small thing that you're doing. And to put this into perspective, a Google search is about 0.2 grams of CO2 equivalent, which is roughly the same weight as a drop of water. So it is a drop in the ocean. But in terms of scale of economy, there are 8.5 million Google searches every day. Which turns out to be about the same weight as 11 blue whales or 1,700 tons of CO2. And that's just in one day. So if you start to look at the economies of scale, the amount of people that are looking at your website, the amount of websites that you have, the amount of people that you can talk to about this, you start to reach a much larger audience and make a much bigger impact. So there's your little shock horror introduction. Hopefully you're suitably terrified. Let's do something about that. And the way we're going to do that is we're going to use a case study. So we're going to go from yuck.com to yum.com. Yuck.com is going to be an absolutely horrible website. We're doing all the things wrong, or at least doing things without knowing what they're doing, basically. So just to introduce you to yuck.com, they're a fictional startup. They're trying to make a quick buck by selling basically rotten food and passing it off as being green. So their green credentials are pretty rubbish. And they're kind of making it up as they go along, basically. And they've got this rather delightful site, which I'll give you a demo of now. Actually, I should be able to. Oh, this is where it all goes wrong, isn't it? Oh no. There it is. Flawless. So you can see they've got, hopefully this is a relatively normal looking site to some people here. They've got a nice big header image. They've got some logos, a little YouTube embed here, some blog posts, a bit of a call to action and a form. There's nothing too wild going on here, hopefully. There's also a little chat icon in the bottom here, so you can talk to them and tell them that you want to buy their rotting food for some reason. And yeah, so that's kind of their site. They feel like they've done a good job with it. But if we kind of scratch under the surface, we can kind of see that there's a lot of things we can do to fix that or make it a lot better. And just to give us a starting point, so there's some kind of baseline data that we can use. So at the moment, they've got a speed index of 5.6 seconds, which is not very good. Time to interactive is awful, 37.9 seconds. Page speed, 38 out of 100. Transfer data, 11.8 megabytes, which is huge for a website. Although we have seen worse, to be fair. And CO2 per page view, and that's per every person coming to that page, 3 grams. And there's this lovely website carbon rating of F, so they're not doing a great job. And we've also added kind of an estimate. If they have about 60,000 views a year, that will kind of generate 187 kilos of CO2 over that year. And we'll use that as kind of like a ballpark as we go through the changes we've made to see basically what the big impacts are and how we can kind of improve things. So phase 1, this is all the big wins. We're not going to change anything on the website. We're just going to lower the emissions by making tweaks behind the scenes. There will be some design tweaks later, but right now we're just going to see what we can do with no difference. First of all, might seem obvious, but we're going to switch to efficient renewable hosting. There's a bunch out there. You can find a green host on the Green Web Foundation, which is a wonderful website. And they basically have like an archive of all the hosts that have green energy, basically wind, solar, etc. I think some of them do, they offset potentially, but I think most of them are just directly green energy. Things like Google Cloud Hosting as well, I think is also green, so that's a good place to go. But they're a really great place to see if your current host is green or not. You should also think about using cloud architecture. Having a little server in the back office is not as efficient as using cloud architecture. They spend a lot of time making them as efficient as possible, so that's a really good thing to think about. And finally, you should also think about any third-party services that are on your site, not just the site that you're hosting, but like your YouTube embeds. They're kind of okay because they're on green energy, as I said, but Twitter and things like that, any embeds that you might have that you're pulling in from another site. So if we switch, we just immediately get a 13% decrease in CO2 over the year. The transfer data hasn't changed. You can see it's still 11.8 megabyte, which makes me cringe a little bit. But you've dropped a whole bunch of CO2, and it's basically just a migration, super easy. And as part of this, you should also make sure that you're doing caching as well to make sure that you're not kind of running those servers, you're not running those end user devices too hard, to make sure that you're not generating or downloading assets again if you don't need to for your users. The dynamic pages are being cached so they don't have to be regenerated by the server every time. These are ways that you can make sure that you're making the most out of your hosting as well. Then we move on to images. Images are probably the biggest factor here. This is a really good place to start, basically. And the image I've got here is basically, it was a study done by the Nielsen Norman Group about how people interact with images on websites. And we all know, it's very tempting to put a nice feel-good image to make a site look really nice. But actually what they found was if people went to the Yale School of Management and they wanted to sign on for a course, they looked basically everywhere except at the image because they didn't care about it. It was like not useful for them. And there's loads of studies out there that kind of say that people just bypass them. They're kind of like ads in a way, and people will just not look at them because it's not useful. And so there's the potential to maybe just not even have an image if you don't think that it is actually adding any useful information. So that's a good place to start. VW did a really good campaign where they had a sustainable browsing experience and they removed all their images. They replaced them with ASCII art. So you got all of these nice characters to generate an image or the look of an image, but actually the carbon emissions were much lower because the data transfer was much lower. So that's one interesting kind of design-led way you can start to influence your sites. Another way is to look at the detail that you're using in your images. So a lovely quote from Tom Greenwood, who's the co-founder of Wholegrain Digital, is that detail is data and data is energy. So the more detailed an image is, the bigger it's going to be. A good example of this is one of our clients, Good Energy. They really wanted to have a high impact header on their homepage, and they were dead set on having a big image. Now, normally we wouldn't recommend this, but we found ways to work with it. So you might not be able to see it here, but we've actually blurred the edges of this image. Our designers have kind of made it very blurry, except in the focus and the center. And actually that's reduced the size of that image by quite dramatically, I believe. I wish I had the stats, but I absolutely do not. I apologize. But yeah, that's another way that you can work with design and with brand to make sure that you're not overloading your site with heavy images, basically. But now into the kind of techie stuff, you can optimize your images. That's a really good place to start. The main areas to think about are the efficient formats that you can use, how you can compress those images, and also how you can size them appropriately, because depending on where you're actually going to look at them, the size they're going to appear, you can overuse your images massively. So in terms of formats, you should be thinking about SVG for icons, shapes, and logos. If the logo is quite complicated, a PNG might be better, but try both out and see how you go. Animated GIFs are actually better as an MP4, generally speaking. And everything else should probably be an AVIF, which has really good support now. I think it's above 90% on caniuse.com with WebP and just generic fallbacks. So those are really good formats to use for all your visuals or your images. In terms of implementation, you can use a picture tag if you need to have fallbacks, if you've got particular browsers that you need to support. You can also use Short Pixel AI and Optimal or other CDNs, clever CDNs. We'll touch on those in a bit to kind of optimize the images that are being output onto the page. And also for WordPress, you can enable SVG upload. There's a great plugin called Safe SVG plugin, which will kind of make sure that there's a security concern with SVGs potentially, and this will help protect you from that. To give you an idea of what improvements you could get, if you convert a JPEG to a WebP, you'll get roughly a 30% improvement, and to an AVIF, you'll get a 50% improvement. And if you think about the amount of images you have on a site, that could be quite dramatic. So how to compress in a bit more detail. For all the devs out there, if you're building a theme, what you can probably do is hand optimize your theme assets, because hopefully there shouldn't be too many of them, and you've got a lot more control over them on a case-by-case basis. For JPEGs and PNGs, I'd recommend Photoshop, Squoosh, or Tiny PNGs. And for SVG, you can use SVG OMG, what an acronym, which I will get to in a moment. For authored content, though, which is probably the bulk of the content you'll get on your site, you can't directly control those individually unless you're managing the content yourself. So we'd recommend something like Short Pixel AI or Optimal. They're both plugins. They both automatically optimize the images on your site, either as they're uploaded or as they're displayed to users. Both of those have a cost, so just be aware of that. It can get quite dramatic if you've got a lot of images or they're all massive, just to bear in mind. And Adobe Illustrator allows you to kind of modify SVGs directly. There's a lot of detail in SVG, and if you're a good designer, which I'm absolutely not, you can make those paths a lot more efficient, and you can trim out a surprising amount if you really want to get down to the very fine detail on how to improve an SVG. But this is SVG OMG, which I mentioned earlier. You've got loads of options on the right-hand side. It's basically a website you can upload an SVG to and strip out stuff you don't think is relevant, stuff that's not necessary. It might be text that's not going to show. It might be XML comments and stuff like that. But basically, you've got a load of options, and you can trim stuff down to, you know, a tenth of the size, a quarter of the size, or something like that. It's a really good tool. And I touched on this earlier, Short Pixel AI or adaptive images. It basically will provide an image at the kind of perfect size for where it appears on the page. And it will kind of store a copy of that, basically. So if you're on mobile at a particular size, it will crop it to that exact size, and then the next people who come to that page at that size will see it again. And it will basically create an optimized version at that specific size, so that you haven't got like a 2000 pixel wide image on a mobile device. It does do kind of intelligent reformatting depending on exactly what you want. So it can convert to a WebP or an AVIF if the browser has that support. The only downside is that it does have a JavaScript dependency. It needs JavaScript to kind of do all that calculation and figure it out for you. So that will increase the size of your page very slightly. So you might need to have a little bit of a calculation there. If you've only got a tiny image, it might not be worth it on that particular page, for example. There's a load of options within Short Pixel. These are the ones that we recommend. Basically, just turn everything on and set it to glossy, which is very nice. But there are far more detailed ones. Guides are available online. And this is probably the big headline that I would go with. Going through all of that on yuck.com, we managed to have a more than 75% decrease in the amount of COT, basically, just from that page that you saw earlier, just decreasing, setting them in the right formats, compressing them, and making sure we had Short Pixel AI on there. So you can see that we've dropped massively. The transfer data is 11.8 to 2.8. And yeah, all the numbers there are basically just over 75%. So it's really dramatic. Your mileage may vary depending on what your page or your site looks like, but for this case, I think that's a pretty dramatic drop. And then we'll briefly touch on responsive image sizing, which we didn't before. Basically, if you're working with WordPress, you can set up some thumbnail sizes if you know that you've got specific breakpoints that you might have along the way. Some of the defaults are good, but they don't cover all device sizes, so you can add your own. You will need to use WP get attachment image, the function, to output the responsive image markup. Very technical, potentially, but that's how you get exactly what you need out of WordPress for those thumbnail sizes, or those image sizes. And you can also use filters to adjust the size attributes, basically, for those contexts if you need to. We're getting into the details here. I don't want to get us lost, so I will move swiftly on. And yeah, basically, you just want to make sure that you're loading the right size image for the place that it's going to appear at, basically. So the source set and sizes attribute basically let the browser load the right image. You should use the picture tag to make that work. But ultimately, that means you're not, again, showing a 2,000 pixel wide image in on an iPhone 6 or something like that. It's just not worth it. So a few things to note. The source set and sizes attributes are based on the full width of the content. So it can be tricky to make that work for columns. You might need to do some calculations, some maths to make that work, because it thinks that it's 100% of the width. But you can optimize the sizes attribute to kind of account for this, basically. So there's some complex WordPress filtering in there, but it is doable. And if you add the sizing on top, we drop again another 41% on this one, not the old number. So we're already down to 22 kilos, which is great. We've made massive strides. Again, the transfer data has dropped, and our page speed performance has rocketed up to 61 from 38. So just by installing a plugin, basically, and just setting some config, picking the right formats, you can have a huge impact. I will also touch on the lazy loading attribute. If you're not familiar with this, it's an attribute for images and for iframes. And basically what it means is if the image or the iframe hasn't scrolled into view, then it just won't load yet. Browsers are quite good at dealing with that right now. And it is just as easy as adding a loading equals lazy attribute. WordPress should do this out of the box, although your theme may vary if you built it yourself in a particular way, or if you're using a third-party theme. So just be aware of that. But it basically means that it just won't be loaded in the browser. So if people don't scroll down, then they won't load the data and waste that carbon. Right, moving on to something a little bit easier, font optimization. Font formats is easy, just use WAF2. There's a bunch out there, don't use any of the others. They're rubbish. No, they are good in other contexts, but for web, WAF2 is the way to go. But importantly, what you can do is you can subset those fonts. And subsetting is basically just selecting only the glyphs or the characters in that font that you know you're going to need. So if you know that you're not going to have any Chinese characters in there and the font comes with those, you can strip those out. If you know that you're not going to need specific accented characters, you can strip those out. So a good example is Cooper Light BT. I think it's a font we used on one of our clients, and they had like 260 glyphs, and we knew we barely needed any of them. So we used a tool called Transfonter. It's a great tool. We use this for pretty much all of our font subsetting. Although I think there's one called Glyphhanger where you can get really like into the detail, depending on your needs. But basically it gives you a bunch of options. Usually what we would tend to select, depending on the language requirements, would be Latin or Latin extended. But you can see there's all kinds of extra font ranges or glyph ranges that you can use to kind of strip down the size of your font files. Oh yeah, I did mention Glyphhanger. Good. So this is kind of the improvements you can expect to see. So before we had 5 fonts, 159, 30, 60, 155. And then stripping those back, you can see we got them down to like 20 instead of 100, 160, 15, 30. You know, you can really make some, not dramatic compared to the images, but you can still make some big improvements in what you're actually delivering to people, what they actually need, rather than just dumping a font on the page, basically. With the font optimization, again, not as dramatic, but we've lost 4 kilos of CO2 over the course of a year, and the transfer data has dropped by like 300 kilobytes. So you can make quite a big improvement there. Right, next. I know I'm going at like 100 miles an hour. I'm just aware there's a lot to get through. Please stop me if you need to breathe. Yes, you can minify scripts and styles. That's a really good place to start as well. This could have a really big impact depending on the amount of styles and scripts that you have. What we would recommend is using a build process to compress that if you're building your own theme. There are optimization plugins out there that will do that for you. Your mileage may vary. Some of them can cause some slight hiccups if you put them on and they kind of concatenate stuff and put stuff in the wrong place. So be careful there. But if you're in control of your own build tools, you can minify stuff. If you're not familiar with what that looks like, basically, here's a CSS file potentially by default, and you minify it and it turns into this. All of the space is taken out. It's all like crushed down. So the browser still can understand it, but it's a lot smaller because you've taken out a bunch of characters, basically. You should also think about removing unnecessary style scripts and markup if you can. A great example is Bootstrap Core, which is about 233 kilobytes, I believe. That might have changed recently. But if you're only using a small portion of that, why are you loading 200 kilobytes? There's kind of no point. You could either write your own or you could take a subset of that. WordPress itself has quite a lot of cruft in there, I would say. Something that we strip out is some of the block styles that come by default. You can really tighten it up and write much smaller styles if you need to. I believe at one point WordPress was also outputting like SVGs for all the duotones that it could do, but I think fortunately it's not doing that anymore. But yeah, it's always good to kind of review what you're outputting and think about whether you actually need it or not, which goes AA for marketing scripts. I think we'll get onto that later. And yeah, if we do that with yuck.com, we can chop off a mighty 38 kilobytes. We're really getting down to the details now. And that's the end of phase one. We haven't changed anything about the site. It looks exactly the same as it did before. We've just kind of optimized it behind the scenes, changed some images around, activated a plugin or two. And everything has massively improved. We've basically made a 90% saving on carbon. I hope that's the next slide. It is, yeah. So you can have a dramatic impact by really not changing much about your website at all, which can be really good. If I jump back a bit, you can see that the time to interactive has dropped massively. The speed index is improved. The transfer data is tiny. The experience for a user will just be better because it will be faster. And hopefully that then will lead to more conversions or more interactions or whatever it is that you want from that website. Okay, phase two. We're getting into the details now. This is going to be fun. A really good place to start with this is to, well, we'll touch on a specific case here, but we'll broaden it out. You can avoid loading dynamic forms. So Gravity Forms is a really good example of this. On the homepage of that site, we had a little form at the bottom. It's basically in the footer of every page. And really, it wasn't necessary. Gravity Forms itself is a little bit naughty for doing this, but it loads tons of scripts and styles onto the page to make all of the like dynamic stuff work. But you don't need to do that. You could just load like a pretty plain form if you don't need it to be like dynamic or use any conditional logic or anything like that. But if it does, you can just link to it. You can just have a contact page which has the form on it. It's an extra click, sure, but a lot of that stuff will be cached, and it basically means that that carbon isn't being used up on every single page on your site. It's certainly a pattern that we've seen in some designs where, you know, you've got a newsletter form everywhere and it's Gravity Forms, and that means you're loading jQuery on every page, which you just don't need to do, basically. Zooming out a little bit, what you can do is lazy load third-party resources. So YouTube is a great example of this. On the page before, we had a YouTube embed. If you use what's called a facade, which is basically a nice little placeholder image and a button, you can just load just those assets, basically. And then when somebody actually interacts with it, when somebody really wants to watch that video, that's when you load the embed in. Google has a good some documentation about facades in general. But this is one example where effectively you can, there's some JavaScript here, but basically if somebody clicks on the button, you get whatever script it is that you need, and then you output it and just hide the button that they've just clicked on. This is a really good example for that chat widget we saw earlier as well. Again, it's really worth thinking about, well, if you've got 100 people come to the site, do all 100 people need that script to load on every page? Are they all going to interact with that chat? Or can you just load a very tiny script there to just drop it in when you need it? If you do that, you get another big drop. on yuck.com. The speed index is basically halved. The transfer data is almost halved. Actually more than halved. That's good. And again, we dropped from 17 kilos in a year down to 7. So just loading the YouTube video and the chat widget we had on there has had a much bigger impact than it might seem at first sight. Another good alternative to videos as well is animations. New Heat is one of our clients, and we built this animation for them for quite a complex animation to describe underfloor heating, heat pumps basically. They're the largest bespoke underfloor heating supplier in the UK. And this animation is in what's called Lottie animations. I definitely recommend looking up those if you've got kind of an illustrated animation video that's going on, because it can be dramatically smaller. I think this animation, which can also be linked to the slider on the right-hand side, so you can kind of page back and forth through that animation. I think it comes in at about 117 kilobytes, which is pretty tiny compared to an equivalent video, sorry. Right, now we're getting into the design. Designers, it's your time to shine. You can just reduce images in design. That's a really good place to start. It's very easy to just take out full width images. I know it doesn't have as big an impact, but there are certainly ways to kind of work around that or work with a brand to make that very exciting. You can also just reduce image sizes in design as well. You don't have to just take them out completely, although that's definitely an option. But yeah, just reducing what you've got there can have a big impact. And yeah, last of all, you can just take them out. The VW example is a great example of that, where they've just binned off their images and they've got ASCII art instead. So if we do that with our delightful yuck.com, we can also think about reducing that image. So we've got the same image, I'll bounce between them, but the left-hand side is just a gradient. There's no image behind that. It looks like there is, but we've basically just dropped the size of that by just splitting it in half. It still has a pretty good impact, I think, but it has a massive impact in terms of the actual data that you're transferring. Again, with things like these cards, it's a standard pattern, I think, where you've got a nice little image and some text and stuff, but actually, is that an informational image? Basically, you could just trim that down to a nice card. People still read it. Basically, there are other designs that you could do around this, but that's an example. And again, the kind of CTA, call out, whatever you want to call it. Again, that image is kind of in the background. It's sitting against some text. There's potentially some accessibility issues there. You could just trim that out and make it into a little bit more of a text-based design to still increase that brand awareness, but without wasting just an image that doesn't really add anything. But yeah, there's loads of different options. If we do that with yuck.com, we reduce all of those images. Again, we're dropping down some more and more. I think that's meant to be a percentage there. I don't know what that square is. We'll skip over that. But yeah, we've basically chopped that in half, again, in terms of the CO2 per page view and the annual emissions, and we're reducing the transferred data massively. Oh no, there it is. Great. Yeah, minus 35%. I meant that. Yeah, that's fine. Good. Yeah, so you can also reduce the amount of font files. We've already optimized them, we've trimmed them down, but often what we see is that loads of weights are used where they're not necessarily required. You could probably do without them. So again, it's about thinking about your choices in your design and in your website build. Do you really need those things? Great example here is that must be quite tricky to see. There's basically multiple different weights in this mobile header. This mobile menu, and just by stripping them out, there we go. It's actually easier to read, and we didn't need to load that extra font file. You can do the same in the footer here, for example. I think it's this copyright in the bottom. We're just going to bold that up because we just don't need the thinner weight. And if you kind of make those design choices early on, and you get client buy-in, you can kind of make those quite easy changes to make. And again, yeah, the improvement is quite small here because we're getting into the details, but it still does have an impact. Everything adds up. The page speed performance is getting up to 90 from 38, which is a pretty big improvement. We're down to 0.07 of a gram compared to, I think it was more than 3 grams every page view. And the annual emissions is dropping like a stone, which is great. So we've made it to the end of phase 2. There is one more phase, I will warn you, prepare yourselves. But we've made massive strides. We've chopped this down by a quarter. And that's when we're kind of making some more design choices, some more technical changes. And we'll see just how far we can go. Phase 3, total commitment, full eco warrior mode. Let's do this. You can just replace all your raster graphics, your PNGs, your JPEGs with vectors. We've done this with some clients where it makes sense for their brand and they have an illustrative style. But basically, you can either replace those with CSS or you can replace them with SVGs. They're far smaller, and actually it can really feed into the brand vibe if you want to go down that direction. Again, we've got this delightful rotting food. You can just change it to this this nice SVG image, which I think in some ways actually adds a little bit more, rather than just kind of a generic background. There's probably some food there. You've got something that's a bit more personable, perhaps. Again, your brand may vary. We can do that throughout the site. So again, with the facade we talked about earlier, you can change that to a delightful bowl of greens. And in the footer, you can maybe take out these kind of fake greenwashing logos and replace them with good ones. And then they become far lighter on your page. We've dropped, again, 30%, more and more. We're getting down to possibly, we're getting down to less than a quarter of a megabyte from 11.8. So we're making grand strides. Analytics, this is a nice painful one. I'm sure everyone's had fights with this. There are lightweight analytics out there. There's a tendency for people to put whatever analytics packages they want on there. They might chuck GTM on there. They might chuck Google Analytics. There might be Hotjar. There might be all sorts, Twitter, Facebook, whatever. Often you don't need all of those things. You kind of need to do a bit of thinking about what data you actually need out of there instead of just putting something on just in case. But you can do quite a lot with very minimal analytics. To give you an example, Google Analytics itself is 17 kilobytes, which doesn't sound like a lot, but it does require cookies. Bit of a GDPR call out there. If you enable it with GTM, it goes up to 75 kilobytes, although you do have the power of GTM. But there are two alternatives that we're aware of. There are more, Fathom and Plausible, which are about a kilobyte each, and they don't require cookies. So I am not a GDPR expert, but you don't need to worry about these when you're doing that. So that's another benefit of using cookie light and lighter analytics. This is Plausible that we use on some of our sites at the moment. You just include a JavaScript snippet for that 1 kilobyte file. It's very simple to just kind of add that in, and it can kind of replace all of these random Facebook things that people put on and then just never look at ever again, basically. And, oh, is it going to do it? You get, if you do that, you strip out all of that unnecessary marketing scripts, you get down to 1.6 kilos, which is a 46% drop. Again, we're getting really down to the wire here of how much carbon is generated on each page. But there is more. We can use system fonts. We don't need to use those fancy fonts that the designers like. Sorry, designers. You can use system fonts. They're already installed on basically every laptop and every device. They basically have no carbon impact because they're there already. They don't need to be downloaded. Different fonts have different power usages if you really want to get into it, based on the amount of points in each character. That is probably a topic for another day, which I will not be speaking about, but you can get down into that detail. So in theory, sans serif fonts are more energy efficient, but I would love to know how at this point, because that is very detailed. And here's some examples of the system fonts. You've got your lovely serif fonts on the left, your lovely sans serif fonts on the right. And generally speaking, you can kind of match up quite easily. I believe it was, I want to say hotels.com that changed entirely to Arial. And that is their brand font now. And it basically saves them a bunch of carbon and data basically on every single one of their pages. If we use system fonts, we've dropped 0.1 of a gram. Very exciting. We've gone down to 1.4 kilos over the year. And the transferred data size is just 100 kilobytes for the whole site. There is more. There is more for those designers out there. You can go dark mode. This might sound crazy, but on OLED screens, because each pixel works like a light bulb, if you're on a darker color, it will use less energy, especially if you go black, because it uses no energy, basically. It doesn't have to be solid black. You can use darker colors. The example here is, please, this is 2016, dark mode users can save 42% of screen energy. So this is back to those end user devices. not necessarily the servers or the transmission networks, but your end user devices. Red and green are about the same. Blue, weirdly, is a little bit more. And then white is the most amount of energy. So if you really want to get into it, dark mode, I know you devs love it, is just better for the environment. So you should always use it. A great example of this is one of our clients, Greenhouse Sports. We did a website refresh, basically. They're a really lovely London-based sports charity, and we did their whole branding design in a much darker style, and it was really impactful. They loved it, and they've had a really good experience so far from their users. So yeah, we can do that with yuck.com as well. We can kind of change it to a darker style. We can, instead of having a light footer, we can make it all the darker brand colors. And we'll rebrand. Why not? We've done a really good job. We'll call it yum.com. It's doing great. Maybe we might actually put some money into real eco food instead of just rotting food. And yeah, there it is. It's looking much better as yum.com. The change is pretty dramatic. If you look at it before and after we've done all of those things, the speed index have dropped down to 1 second from 5.6. Time to interactive has again dropped from 37.9 seconds down to 1 second, which is pretty wild. We're getting up to almost 100 out of 100 for page speed performance. The transfer data is less than 100 kilobytes, and we're kind of scraping along at 0.02 grams of CO2 per page view, which is obviously an A+ in website carbon. And the annual emissions have dropped to 1.4 kilos. And that's that. That's all the details of some very detailed things that you can do to improve your website. Do you have any questions? Thank you.
Cheers, Tommy.
No, no worries.
Has anybody got any questions for Tommy about that?
Kind of raced through that. Apologies. There was lots to get through.
Got one over here.
Thanks, Tommy. That was great. All those emissions that you were showing, the differences, were they using the whole grain?
The website
app?
carbon tool, you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Or-
absolutely. So depending on what audit we're doing, we'll do benchmarking before we make changes and do benchmarking afterwards, because we kind of know what we're doing. We know that the impact that it will have. The kind of shorthand, as I said earlier, is data is equal to energy. So if you know that you're transferring less data, you know that you've made a difference. So that's kind of the easy shorthand. But it is very nice to go from an F to an A, because you know that you've chopped out 2 megabytes or something like that. But we do use that as part of our audits. So we will do full site audits potentially, or pick select pages, and we'll run those through the tool, see where they are as a benchmark, make the improvements, and then you can see the impact that you're having. I think we recently did, I'm not going to remember the numbers, so this is a useless anecdote. We recently did some work with a company called Immediate Media, who work for the BBC Good Food, and we made some suggestions to them. There's actually an article about it in Branch magazine, which you should look up on the internet. And basically, we just did a whole audit for them. We did a workshop for them, and they made some design changes across some of their recipes on BBC Good Food. And it had, I really want to say, an amount of tons of difference over their year based on the traffic they get, because they're a very high traffic site. And so, you know, even making a small design change there can have a sweeping effect for, you know, if you're going to go and look up a lasagna or whatever. Does that answer your question?
No, for sure.
I feel like I went off on a tangent there.
So, but I mean, that app is free to available, is it?
It is, yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely.
okay.
So as I said, it does 1 page at a time. You can't put like your whole website in and expect it to just crawl everything. I think there are some tools that do similar things that are out there. We're having conversations with various companies and various people to try and figure out if there are ways to improve that, make that process a bit easier. But at the moment, it is 1 page per crawl, yeah.
Cool. And I mean, a lot of the things that you're suggesting are also to do with optimizing.
Absolutely.
And they're all the same kind of things. All the platforms like WordPress, for example, do they now have they got a regard for that when they're building
Great question.
Next stage? Or,
Yeah, so WordPress is probably a tricky one, because there's so many teams doing different things throughout WordPress. And also there are different contributors doing different things throughout the network. But last year, the sustainability team for WordPress was set up. And so they're meant to be kind of bringing everything together, not just from an environmental sustainability point of view, but from the sustainability of the project as a whole, how it keeps going on into the future and changes and evolves, and the sustainability of like the finance, for example, of how people can keep contributing without actively being paid to an open source community project. But yes, that team is quite new, I think, but it's kind of one of those ones that helps the other teams and interacts with them. Yeah.
Oh, cool.
I couldn't tell you about other CMSs though.
Thanks.
Cheers. Any others? Oh,
Thanks. That was really great. Did you? I'm not sure whether you talked about compression of the data from the server.
Yeah, absolutely. That's definitely a big thing. So I didn't touch on it here, but you can do server compression. So gzip, Brotli, stuff like that.
Yeah, I wondered whether is it kind of obvious that because there's some extra energy required for the compression decompression algorithm. Is it always obvious? Is it always a good idea, or does it depend on how many visitors?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I think that would probably depend on your visitors. Again, it's a pinch of salt kind of thing, or like that testing. Yes, in theory, much like caching. If you cache something and hopefully it gets out to 100 people, then that's better than just sending the same thing, like regurgitating it every time. In theory, the amount of traffic would have to be pretty small for it to not make a difference, basically. I think we generally recommend turning it on unless you've got a really good reason not to. Yeah, basically.
So you would do that by default.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, unless there's a particular reason that you wouldn't do that, I would recommend it.
I mean, it's something we've been looking into. I'm asking something we've been looking into.
Yeah.
There is a security issue of pages that parrot back user input.
Yeah.
So if you've got a form that has a review stage, then there's a security reason not to do that, because with the gzip, it makes it easier to get secrets on the page. So that's a reason.
Sure.
But that's a fairly small.
Sure, absolutely.
Pages on the site.
Yeah, I hadn't heard of that, but that is interesting. One for us to look into for sure. Yeah, but generally speaking, if there isn't a security concern there, or if you don't have like very tiny traffic or another specific reason, I would definitely recommend compression. Yeah, for sure. Great, thank you.
any other questions? Yeah.
Thank you. That was great.
Thank you.
So everything that you talked about there was about performance and optimization, right? And so that's how you sell it to your clients.
Absolutely, yeah.
And I think once or twice you alluded to it, but do you ever sell something on the basis of the environmental impact, or are clients just interested in the performance?
Yeah, that's a really good point, actually. And sometimes we get clients who have multiple stakeholders, and some of those stakeholders are really invested in the sustainability aspect, and some of them have business reasons to not be, or think that they have business reasons to not care about sustainability. And often it's easy to sell it to them through a different lens, basically. That might be performance, and that means that you will get better SEO, or it might mean that you get more conversions. Often we will basically create a site with the intention of saying, well, yeah, it's going to be performant, and you kind of get sustainability as a bonus. And about 50% of clients, that's a ballpark figure, will be more interested in sustainability, and the other half will be just like, okay, it's great that it's fast, and we kind of not tick a box, but we get this bonus alongside. Again, it's really about figuring out what the stakeholders want, what their needs are. Usually you can link the performance to sustainability or vice versa, and then get buy-in that way, basically.
Okay, so that's actually higher than I was expecting you to say.
I think we are slightly biased is probably the wrong word. We do tend to work with non-profits, charities, organizations that are in that space already. So our clients are probably not an accurate representation of everybody's clients in the industry. So we are probably more likely to have clients that heavily want to focus on it or see it as one of their objectives for the site. But there are definitely ways to kind of sell it to people who are less than eager about it, or think that it might compromise something else in the site.
Yeah, well, that's encouraging anyway, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's taking off as well. I mean, I said at the start we're the original sustainability WordPress London agency, but there are lots of agencies out there that are starting to do the same. There are loads of companies out there that aren't even in the WordPress space that are now starting to focus on sustainability. It's been the buzzword for the last 5 years or whatever, and people are really starting to catch up. And actually, that's a really good thing. It doesn't matter that we're not the only ones. It means that's now reaching more people. So we're having more of an impact across the web. We can't churn out every single website on the whole internet. So it's really good that other companies are doing that as well. Yeah, thank you.
So I'm quite interested in, a lot of the things are already there, they're out there.
Yeah.
But I'm quite interested in ideas, or if you have any ideas around energy efficiency on the coding side and the back end side, because from a developer point of view, most people historically have wanted their code to run as fast as possible,
Yeah.
et cetera, and there are ways to not hammer the processor, and you would say like a kind of asynchronous stuff would help you to do that. But it gets down into really kind of fine-grained things, but do you have any thoughts around kind of energy efficiency in a kind of coding scenario at your company?
Yeah. As far as I'm aware, different programming languages do actually have different efficiencies depending on what it is. So I think Ruby, for example, is like really up there. It's really great and efficient. Go as well, by Google, is really good. PHP is actually getting a lot better, obviously through PHP 8 and stuff like that. And JavaScript's pretty good. We tend not to. There's a couple of reasons we tend not to worry about it, basically. One is that we're a WordPress agency, and so to an extent we are limited to those programming languages. If we were working with a different CMS or in a different environment entirely, we could start to worry about those things. But also the impact is quite small, and there are higher return on investment changes that we could make, basically. That's not to say that those efficiencies aren't there, but that might be phase 4. We've done the eco warrior stuff, and now we're thinking about what programming language we can start to build that in. So it's a factor, but not one we encounter often. Again, partly because we're an agency, we're not building our own product, our own tool. We're building for people, and those people, as much as they might love the planet and sustainability, they have a limited budget, and they probably can't afford to pay us to look into creating it in Ruby instead of PHP.
Yeah, but I sort of mean, within the constraint of WordPress, for example, if you've got things that pull in posts, for example, those sorts of things, you can truncate the loop, so you're not just piling in masses of extra stuff in the same way that you kind of do with lazy loading. Those sorts of things.
Definitely.
But I'm sort of looking at I'm interested in looking at ways at how you can kind of drop the processor cycling that's required for, if you think that if you're building with a compiler, back-end compiler, and you're running that and you're deving and you're doing it all day, blah, 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 you're kind of churning a lot of energy. So you've got production. You did mention at the beginning, more in terms of device stuff, but there is a production impact to creating sites, which is sort of more hidden.
Yeah, there's a few things that we're kind of looking at there. So a couple of things I can maybe touch on are kind of build tools. That's a really good one. We've got 5 devs and also some other contractors that work with us. And if we run build tools that are inefficient or slow and we're constantly building, that could potentially have an impact. Because that's on a device level and doesn't really relate to website carbon, we don't really have a way of tracking that, but obviously there would be an energy impact there for sure. So we are actively looking to make sure our build tools are as efficient as possible, for example. Another example is backups as well. And that's kind of more related to your server storage. We're getting a little bit away from the programming question you asked, but if you're starting to store all those backups, you have to realize that there's a weight attached to those backups somewhere. Some websites will only store backups for 7 days. Some tools will store them for a year. And that's the kind of point where no worries. No, thank you. That's the kind of questions you start asking yourself. Do we need 365 backups, or do we need 12 months of backups and then a week, for example? And you can start to get into those questions of efficiency and what do we need? Is it easy to take this out? And is it essential, basically? But programming languages, build tools, processing, obviously those are kind of parts of the back-end efficiencies that we should be thinking about, whilst trying not to get trapped into the early optimization point, for sure. Thank you.
Cool. Any more questions?
I'm going to ask one more.
Okay.
Unless I missed it, your tool that assesses how
Yeah.
How are you measuring that? What parameters are you using? How does that work?
Yeah, sure. So it's a closely guarded secret, but ultimately we're no. We're basically looking at the data transfer as the primary metric. There are a load of tools out there that are open source. I think CO2.js is one of them. Dan actually knows a bit more about the details that we use more than I do, but I think we use a different algorithm. Is that right?
Yeah, it's kind of the same working group works, not figuring out what the algorithm should be, but then there's kind of slight variations in that in terms of some might take more, like slightly different figure into account for data centers. Or, yeah, it's a bit of variation, but it's broadly the same.
Yeah. Exactly that, yeah. So there's a load of different things that come in. Returning visitors used to be a thing that we considered, for example. But broadly, it is data transfer size, and that will land you on that scale of A+ to F, basically. The interesting part about it is that the kind of global average is an F, and we would love that to come up. So spread the word. Yeah. Yeah. It is a little bit frightening, yeah.
That's the question I had, I think. If there's like one thing that everybody should do, what should it be? It seems like it's related to images.
I think it is definitely images, yeah. It's interesting because I think there's definitely a draw to having that high impact design and that high impact imagery. Actually, the way to kind of not combat that, but address that is before the dev stage, well into the design and the brand phase, right? You can, if you're a brand designer, you can say that, well, actually, we don't use images, or all of our assets are illustrative. And that means you can use SVGs if you know about that ahead of time. It's very hard if you're a dev to be given a design and be like, well, that's just big images. I can't do anything. There's limited stuff you can do at that point. So actually having that really strong conversation and those connections with the design part. If you're a designer already, that's great. But if you're a dev that doesn't design, you have to kind of make those connections with the rest of the team or the people that you're working with to educate them about that if they don't already know, and say, well, have you considered doing a half-size image because it will make the site run faster, for example. Images is generally it. Again, your mileage may vary depending on what's on the site. But yeah, pretty much that. Unless you're loading 3,000 versions of Hotjar, obviously. That's another thing.
I've definitely worked on some sites like that. Any other questions?
Just a very quick one.
Yeah.
Are the slides, will the slides be available for this?
That is a great question, and I will get back to you on that.
Thank you.
Yes, maybe.
We'll message if they are.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
We have got one question online.
Oh,
if you
great.
guys don't mind
Brilliant.
reading it out.
Absolutely.
Tristan wants to know, do you work the metric improvements just on single pages or journey? As a long page, cut to 3 pages, you must visit.
That, if I'm understanding the question correctly, that's a really great question. So let me try and summarize. There is a way that you could make a long page into 3 separate pages, and that would be, you could take advantage of the caching that you would get along the way, and maybe people would drop out of that journey, which means that you're burning less carbon and CO2 because they're not looking at one big page. Like 80% of the people just don't make it to page 3, for example. There are ways to do that through the kind of UX journey, absolutely. And again, I feel like that's a really good opportunity to start leveraging like A/B testing or like a UX audit, basically. It's really hard to kind of know that ahead of time, especially if you've got like a journey that you're desperate for people to complete, like a donation form, for example, that spreads across like 3 or 4 pages where you've got to collect, their bank details and their home address and whether they want to gift aid it and things like that. So it's really, that's something that you would need to workshop, basically. But it's definitely something that you should consider. Absolutely. Yeah, the kind of UX journey can have a big impact as well as the design and the branding, for sure. I am not a UX or or brand designer, so I can't really speak to that brilliantly, but it does have an impact for sure. Great, thank you.
Says thank you.
Yes. I hope I answered your question.
Any more? No? Well, we can continue this discussion down the pub, I suppose. Right. Thanks, Tommy. Thanks a lot. What a great start to this new era of WordUp. Yeah, that was really good. Thank you very much. So get it in your diaries for next month. It's the 2nd of July, I think, if I've remembered it right. Like, we might end up at the Caxton again. I'm not sure at the moment. Like, so but keep an eye out. Like, what else? Yeah, I think we should retire to the pub if everybody would like a drink. I was thinking we could go to the Walrus, like, just a street away over there. And yeah, if there's any beer left, have a little beer. But yeah, I'll see you all soon. All right, cheers.